The boardroom had gone completely silent. Celeste Winslow, 30 years old, worth $12 billion, founder of one of the most powerful companies on the planet, stood at the head of a mahogany table surrounded by lawyers, executives, and men who had spent decades learning how to smile while they lied. The merger papers were right there, one signature away from the largest deal of her career. She picked up the pen. Then she looked across the room at Logan Pierce, the logistics manager nobody paid attention to, the quiet single father who always left work at exactly 5 o'clock because a 7-year-old girl was waiting at home, and she set the pen back down. "I'm not signing." The room didn't just go quiet, it stopped breathing, and somewhere near the back, a man who had spent 3 years engineering this exact moment felt the ground shift beneath his expensive shoes. If you're new here, welcome. This channel tells stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe right now so you don't miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while, and it's worth every minute. The accident happened on a Tuesday. Not that Logan Pierce had been paying close attention to the day of the week. Since his wife, Dana, died 4 years ago, days had a way of blurring together into one long exercise and getting through without falling apart. Tuesdays felt the same as Thursdays. Saturdays were only different because Sophie had soccer practice, and he had to remember to pack extra socks because she always, without fail, kicked hers off somewhere between the parking lot and the field, and then complained her feet were cold. He was thinking about socks, actually, when he saw the black SUV run the red light. It happened fast the way bad things always do, not like in the movies where time slows down and the hero has space to think. 1 second, Logan was merging onto Hargrove Avenue, coffee balanced in the cup holder, Sophie's backpack sitting in the passenger seat, because she'd left it in his car again. The next second, the SUV came screaming through the intersection doing at least 60, clipped a sedan hard enough to send it spinning, and then, because physics doesn't negotiate, the sedan came straight at the concrete divider where a woman was standing on the narrow pedestrian strip, looking at her phone. She didn't see it coming. Logan was already out of his truck before he'd consciously decided to move. Muscle memory, maybe. Or maybe just the part of him that had never fully come home from the places the Navy had sent him. He covered the distance in maybe 3 seconds, grabbed the woman by the arm, and pulled her hard off the divider just as the sedan's front end caved into the concrete exactly where she'd been standing. They both went down on the sidewalk. He took most of the landing on his left shoulder. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the woman, dark hair, sharp eyes, a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than Logan's truck, pushed herself upright and looked at him the way people look at something they can't immediately categorize. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His shoulder was already throbbing. "No." She looked at the crushed concrete divider, then back at him. You were standing in the wrong spot," he said. Not unkindly, just factually. She stared at him, not with the gratitude people usually perform for strangers, the breathless thank yous, and the hand-to-chest gestures. She stared at him the way someone does when they're trying to figure something out and can't quite get there. "Celeste Winslow," she said. "I know who you are," Logan said. And he did, vaguely. Everyone in the company knew the face of the founder. He'd seen her exactly once before, across a parking garage 3 months after he'd been hired, and he'd thought she looked like someone who made decisions faster than other people made excuses. Logan Pierce, logistics. "Logistics," she repeated. "Third floor." He got to his feet, checked his shoulder, movable, probably bruised but not broken, and then offered her his hand. She took it. Her grip was firm, which surprised him, and then he wasn't sure why it surprised him. "Thank you," she said. "Sure." He picked up his keys from where they'd skittered across the sidewalk. "You might want to call someone. That's going to be a scene in a few minutes." He nodded at the sedan where the driver was already climbing out looking stunned but functional. He got back in his truck. He drove to pick up Sophie. He never thought about it again. Or rather, he tried not to. Logan Pierce had a policy about certain things, and the policy was simple. You did what needed doing, and then you moved on. Because standing around waiting to be thanked had never once put dinner on the table or helped a 7-year-old with her multiplication tables. Celeste Winslow, however, thought about it. The thing about Winslow Global was that it had never been small. Celeste had built it at 22 with a software licensing idea that her own professors had called naive, $110,000 in startup capital borrowed against everything she owned, and a willingness to work hours that would have broken someone who hadn't already been broken by other things first. The company was worth $4 billion before she turned 26. By 30, it had tripled. It operated in 37 countries. It employed just under 9,000 people. And inside it, like a tumor that had grown slowly enough that nobody noticed until it was already doing damage, lived Marcus Hale. Marcus was 54, silver-templed, and had the kind of boardroom presence that made shareholders feel safe and competitors feel uneasy. He'd been Winslow Global's vice chairman for 6 years, brought in during an expansion phase when Celeste had needed someone who knew the political geography of legacy finance. He was good at his job. He was also, in ways that had taken years to become visible, methodically building a parallel structure of loyalty and influence inside the company that Celeste didn't entirely control. She felt it sometimes. The way a conversation would shift when she walked into a room. The way certain proposals arrived already shaped by consensus she hadn't been part of building. She couldn't point to anything specific, which was exactly the way Marcus preferred it. When she told her assistant, Priya, that she'd been pulled off a concrete divider by someone from the logistics department, Priya had looked it up in 30 seconds. Logan Pierce, Priya said, hired 2 years ago. Former military. His file just says U.S. Navy, honorable discharge, no specifics. Before that, nothing in civilian employment. Single father, 1 daughter, 7 years old. Performance reviews are, okay, these are unusual. Unusual how? Every review says something like exceeds expectations in ways that are difficult to quantify. His direct supervisor wrote, and I'm quoting, "I don't know how he does what he does, but the numbers always work out, and the team runs better when he's around." Celeste had looked out her office window for a moment. "Set up a brief," she said. "Nothing formal. Just, I'd like to know who this person is." Logan didn't know what to make of the meeting request. It arrived through official channels, which meant it wasn't a mistake, but it also didn't include much explanation. Just a time, a floor number, and his name on a calendar that he was fairly certain he had no business being on. His supervisor, a decent enough man named Frank Dooley, had looked both puzzled and slightly worried when Logan mentioned it. "The C-suite," Frank said. "Conference room B on 12. Her assistant sent it." Frank looked at him the way people look at someone who's just casually mentioned winning the lottery. "Did you do something?" "Not that I know of." He wore the better of his 2 dress shirts. He left precisely enough time to park, check in with building security, and get to the 12th floor without rushing, because rushing was something he'd trained out of himself years ago. It made you sloppy, and sloppiness in his old line of work had consequences that didn't appear in performance reviews. Celeste was already in the conference room when he arrived. No assistant, no entourage, just her, a legal pad, and a cup of coffee that looked like it had gone cold. "Mr. Pierce," she said. "Ms. Winslow. Sit down, please." She gestured at the chair across from her, and he sat, and there was a beat where she seemed to be figuring out how to start something she hadn't entirely scripted. "I wanted to thank you, properly. You thanked me at the scene." "I said thank you. That's not the same thing." She looked at him steadily. "I've been trying to understand why you did what you did." Logan looked back at her. "Because you were going to get hit." "That's the physical answer." "It's the only answer there is." She studied him. He didn't fill the silence with anything, which seemed to surprise her. Most people, he'd noticed, couldn't tolerate a quiet room and rush to say something, anything, to fill it. Logan had spent enough time in environments where silence meant something specific to have learned that it was worth waiting through. "You didn't come to HR, she said. "You didn't talk to anyone in the company about it. You didn't ask for anything." "Why would I?" "Because people do," Celeste said. There was something flat in her voice when she said it. Not cynicism exactly. Something older than cynicism. Something that had been earned through specific experiences rather than general disappointment. People find ways to turn a good moment into leverage. It's just what happens. "That's not why I got out of the truck," Logan said. She nodded. She looked down at the legal pad, which had nothing written on it, and then back up at him. "How long have you been in logistics?" she asked. 2 years. "You were in the Navy before that." Yes. What did you do? He let the smallest pause happen. Logistics, he said. She almost smiled. It moved across her face and then was gone, but it had been there. Fair enough, she said. I appreciate you coming up. He stood. Mr. Pierce? Her voice caught him at the door. Do you enjoy the work? What you're doing on 3? He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. I'm good at it, he said. That's not the same as enjoying it, but being good at something and having it matter to people, that covers a lot of ground. He left. Celeste sat in the empty conference room for a while after, turning her cold coffee in her hands. The months that followed didn't announce themselves as anything significant. Logan went back to the 3rd floor. He managed shipping timelines and vendor relationships and a team of 14 people who ranged from brilliant to functional to one guy named Terrence, who was technically proficient but chronically late and needed to be reminded about the difference between his personal calendar and the company calendar approximately once a month. Logan managed all of it with the same steadiness he brought to everything, not because he didn't feel the friction, but because he'd long ago made a decision that how he handled the hard parts would be the thing his daughter watched and remembered. Sophie was 7, and she was watching everything. She had her mother's laugh, sudden and a little too loud for indoor spaces, the kind that made strangers look over and then smile despite themselves. She had Logan's stubbornness, which he recognized every single time it showed up in her and tried not to find it funny. She was in 2nd grade, passionate about dinosaurs, deeply skeptical of Brussels sprouts, and convinced that her stuffed rabbit, whose name was Captain Fluffington, was protecting the apartment from bad dreams. Logan had bought Captain Fluffington from a gas station during a road trip when Sophie was 3, and a thunderstorm had made her inconsolable, and it was the only soft thing within arm's reach. The rabbit had a slightly uneven face and one ear that flopped at an angle that suggested a manufacturing defect rather than intention. Sophie thought he was perfect. Logan thought a lot about that sometimes, the way a kid could see something slightly broken and decide the flaw was the point. He picked her up every day at 5:15 from the after-school program at Millhaven Elementary. He cooked dinner, actual dinners, because feeding a child cereal and granola bars every night was not a standard he was willing to settle for, even if his cooking vocabulary was limited to about 12 recipes cycling in rotation. He helped with homework, which in 2nd grade meant dinosaur research projects and reading comprehension worksheets that asked Sophie to describe what the characters were feeling, which she found much harder than the dinosaur facts. How do we know what they're feeling? Sophie asked one evening, frowning at a story about a boy who lost his dog. You look at what they do, Logan said, not just what they say. She chewed her pencil, which he told her not to do, and she did it anyway. The boy keeps going to the park, she said slowly, even when the dog isn't there. And what does that tell you? She thought about it. That he's still hoping. There you go. She wrote it down carefully in her 2nd grade handwriting. Logan watched her and felt the specific wordless ache that came with being the only parent in the room. The feeling that every ordinary moment like this one was both enough and not quite. 3 months after the conference room meeting, Celeste made a decision that nobody inside Winslow Global fully understood. The Meridian Initiative was a humanitarian supply chain project the company had nominally committed to 3 years earlier, a program designed to coordinate logistics for emergency aid distribution across underdeveloped regions in Southeast Asia and East Africa. It had been structurally underfunded, administratively neglected, and repeatedly deprioritized in favor of revenue-generating divisions. On paper, it existed. In practice, it was a room with some spreadsheets in it, and a project manager who had updated the file headers but not the actual content. Celeste assigned Logan Pierce to lead it. The announcement came through internal channels on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Marcus Hale had appeared in Celeste's office for the first time without an appointment. The logistics manager, he said. His name is Logan Pierce. I know his name. Marcus sat down without being asked, which was a habit she'd tolerated for too long. Celeste, the Meridian Initiative has been a political asset for 2 years. We manage it carefully. We put someone in there who's going to actually try things, and we lose control of the optics. I want it to work, Celeste said, not look like it works. That's very idealistic. It's my company, Marcus. He looked at her with an expression she'd seen before, patient, smooth, the look of someone who was calculating something at a speed the conversation didn't reveal. "Of course," he said. "I just think we should find someone with the appropriate profile." "I've made my decision," she said. He left. Celeste sat at her desk and didn't let herself think too hard about why she'd made the choice she had. Because the honest answer was partly that she'd watched Logan Pierce manage an impossible shipping crisis in November, a 3-week supply chain collapse that should have taken 60 days to untangle, and he'd done it in 11, quietly, without drama, without once making the problem about himself. And partly it was the conference room, the way he'd answered her questions without performing the answers. She wasn't foolish enough to call that a solid basis for a major personnel decision, but she also trusted her instincts, and her instincts had built a $12 billion company. She went with her instincts. Logan took the assignment seriously, which was the only way he took anything. He spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but listening to aid organizations, to regional coordinators, to people who'd been trying to make the program work with inadequate resources and kept getting told to wait. He didn't walk in with solutions. He walked in with a notebook and questions, and he wrote down the answers, and he read them at night after Sophie was asleep. His team on Meridian was small. 6 people pulled from different departments, none of them at senior level, all of them used to being told their ideas were premature. He met with them in a conference room on the 7th floor that still smelled faintly of someone's decade-old ambition, and he said, "I don't care how things were managed before. I care what actually works." Nadia, a 29-year-old supply analyst who had submitted 3 proposals that had been ignored, stared at him. "You mean that?" she said. "I don't say things I don't mean." She opened her laptop. Over the following months, the Meridian Initiative became something. Not overnight. It was incremental and sometimes backtracking, and there were weeks where the supply chain data looked like chaos, and Logan had to hold the team together through sheer consistency rather than any particular answer. But by month 4, delivery timelines had improved by 38%. By month 6, the program had distributed aid to communities that the previous system had consistently missed. People noticed. Not just inside Winslow Global. The aid organizations noticed, the regional governments noticed, and then slowly the media started noticing, because a corporate humanitarian project that was actually functioning was unusual enough to write about. Logan's name appeared in an article in a business publication that Celeste read on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand. The article called the Meridian Initiative a quiet logistical revolution. It mentioned the project lead only in a single line at the end. Logan Pierce, head of the initiative, declined to be interviewed. She smiled at that. She was still smiling when Priya sent her a forward of Marcus Hale's private calendar, flagged by their internal compliance system as unusual, which was how she first understood that Marcus had been having meetings she wasn't aware of, with people she didn't recognize in the weeks immediately following Logan's appointment. The smile faded. She called her security director, and the question she asked was not dramatic. It was simple. "I need to know," she said, "what Marcus Hale is building." It took 11 days to start getting answers. They were worse than she'd expected, and the worst part, the part that made her set the phone down and sit very still at her desk, was that the answers had Logan Pierce's name in them. Not as a participant, as a target. Someone had decided to make him the most convenient person to destroy. And the destruction had already begun. The first story appeared on a Thursday. Logan saw it the way most people see bad news, sideways, by accident, on someone else's screen. He was walking through the 7th floor break room when he noticed Terrence from his old team standing very still in front of the coffee machine, phone in hand, reading something with the specific kind of attention people give to things they wish they hadn't found. "What is it?" Logan asked. Terrence looked up, and the expression on his face was the answer before the words were. "There's an article," he said, "about you." Logan took the phone. The headline was from a financial news outlet that specialized in the kind of corporate gossip that dressed itself up as investigative journalism. Winslow Global's surprise promotion. Who is Logan Pierce, and what does he want? The article was 7 paragraphs long and said almost nothing directly. It didn't have to. The implication was loaded into every sentence like weight into a structure designed to collapse. A man with an obscured military background, no elite corporate credentials, no network of influential contacts, had received an unusual series of promotions from a billionaire founder who had publicly rejected a billion-dollar merger under unexplained circumstances. Anonymous sources inside the company, always anonymous, always multiple, always conveniently vague, described the relationship between Celeste Winslow and her logistics manager as unusual and closer than appropriate given the professional distance that should exist at executive level. Logan read it twice. Then he handed the phone back to Terrence. "Thanks," he said. He got his coffee and went back to his office. For a long time, he sat at his desk without opening his computer. The window faced west, and the morning light was coming in at an angle that put half the room in shadow and half in pale winter sun, and he stared at the line where those two things met and thought about the particular problem of being accused of something true enough to be dangerous and false enough to be insulting at the same time. He hadn't maneuvered anything. He'd done his work. The promotions had come to him the way all the meaningful things in his life had come, not because he'd reached for them, but because he'd been standing in the right place at the right time doing the right thing without keeping score. That was not a defense that played well in a headline. It was the kind of answer that sounded like exactly what a calculated person would say to seem uncalculated. He called Sophie's school, just to check. The secretary said she was fine in class, had eaten her whole lunch. He hung up and got back to work. That evening, while Sophie was drawing at the kitchen table, elaborate diagrams of what she'd informed him was a velociraptor city, Logan made dinner and thought through the geometry of what was happening. He was good at that. In his Navy years, a significant portion of survival had depended on the ability to separate emotion from situation long enough to understand the shape of what you were actually dealing with. The emotion could come later. First, you needed the picture. The picture was not good. Someone with access to internal company information and relationships with journalists was pushing a narrative. The narrative had a purpose, and the purpose was not, he suspected, about him at all. He was a means to an end, and the end was Celeste. Sophie looked up from her velociraptor city. "Dad, are velociraptors smart?" "Smarter than most people think," Logan said. "Smarter than people?" "Debatable." She considered that with the seriousness she brought to scientific questions. "I think they were smart enough to figure out who their real enemies were," she said, and then went back to drawing. Logan stirred the pasta and didn't say anything. "I went to sleep that night with the specific alertness of someone who knew that what had started was not finished." He was right. The second story appeared 9 days later, and it was worse. This one came from a different outlet, a larger one, with a wider readership and a reputation for being, if not exactly trustworthy, at least rigorous enough to scare people. The headline was, "Inside Winslow Global, Questions Emerge About Contractor Relationships Linked to Meridian Initiative Lead." It was accompanied by what appeared to be internal documents, partially redacted purchase orders, vendor communications, and a single email that quoted Logan by name in a discussion about contract modifications. The implication was specific this time. Not vague insinuation about personal proximity to a billionaire, but something that looked, to a reader who didn't know the actual context, like evidence of financial manipulation. The contracts referenced were ones Logan had legitimately restructured during the Meridian Initiative's overhaul. He'd renegotiated vendor terms, eliminated middlemen who were inflating costs, and redirected the savings directly into the program's operational budget. Every modification had been approved, documented, and reported through proper channels. But the documents in the article had been selectively excerpted. What was missing was the approvals. What was missing was the context. What was left was the appearance of a man quietly redirecting money in ways that benefited vendors he'd personally selected. Nadia called him at 7 in the morning. "Logan," her voice was tight. "Have you seen it?" "Yes." "Those contracts, I was there for every single one of those decisions. This is completely, I know. What are we going to do?" "Right now, nothing," he said. "Don't talk to anyone about it. Not colleagues, not journalists, not anyone outside this conversation." "But it's wrong. People are going to—" "Nadia." He kept his voice level. "I understand. But responding to something like this from a reactive place almost never helps. We let the compliance team do their work, we make sure our documentation is accessible, and we don't make this bigger by reacting like it's bigger than it is." There was a pause. "Do you actually believe that?" He thought about it honestly. "I believe it's the right strategy," he said. Whether I feel it right now is a different question. She exhaled. Okay, she said. Okay, I'll keep my head down. He drove Sophie to school that morning along the usual route, the same one he drove every single day. She was talking about something her teacher had said about ecosystems, about how every part of a system depended on every other part. And if you removed one thing without understanding what it connected to, the whole structure could shift in ways you didn't predict. That's a good lesson, Logan said. Mr. Alderman says it applies to everything, not just nature. Mr. Alderman is right. He walked her to the door of the school the way he always did, watched her backpack bounce away through the entrance, and then stood in the parking lot for a moment in the cold morning air, feeling something he almost never let himself feel in front of another person. The specific, clean sensation of being afraid. Not for himself. He'd been afraid for himself enough times that the feeling had been reduced, through repetition, to something manageable, a signal rather than an emergency. This was fear for Sophie, because he understood now what kind of operation this was. The financial narrative wasn't the point. The financial narrative was pressure. And pressure, when it didn't produce the desired result, escalated. He drove to work. He had not yet been told that 3 days earlier, an anonymous call had been made to the principal's office at Millhaven Elementary. He found out that afternoon. The school's security coordinator, a careful woman named Ms. Holt, called him just after 2 o'clock. Her voice had the professional calm of someone trained to deliver difficult information without amplifying it. Mr. Pierce, we received a call. The caller identified themselves as a concerned parent. They indicated that... A pause. They indicated that your daughter may be in contact with individuals connected to your workplace and that there was a potential safety concern. Logan's hand tightened on the phone. What kind of safety concern? They didn't specify. The call was anonymous. We've reviewed our protocols and everything here is standard. Sophie had a normal day. She's in her classroom right now, but I wanted you to be aware. Thank you, he said. I'll be there at pickup. He sat for a moment after the call ended. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out the resignation letter he'd written 3 weeks ago and not sent. The one he'd drafted in a moment of clarity at 11 o'clock at night, sitting at the kitchen table after Sophie was asleep, thinking about the shape of what was coming and what the responsible thing was for a man in his specific situation to do. He'd written it and folded it and put it in the drawer because he wasn't sure yet, because he knew leaving wasn't simple, and walking away from work that actually mattered was not a decision to make quickly. He wasn't sure anymore that he had the luxury of moving slowly. He picked Sophie up at 5:15. She came out of the after-school program with her backpack half unzipped and something purple on her sleeve that she insisted was paint and not marker, though it was clearly marker. He held her hand in the parking lot, longer than he usually did, and she noticed. "Dad," she said, "I'm not a baby." "I know," he said. "Then why are you holding my hand so tight?" He looked down at her. "Sorry," he said. He loosened his grip, but didn't let go. She squinted up at him in the fading winter light. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." "You look like you look when you're trying not to show me something," she said. He stopped walking. He crouched down so they were eye level. Sophie's face was serious and watchful, the way it got when she'd decided a situation required her full attention. "I'm working on something complicated," he said. "At work. It's going to be fine, but it's taking up some space in my head." "Is it about the stuff on the internet?" He went very still. "What stuff on the internet?" "Emma's mom was talking about it at pickup last week. She said your name. I didn't understand all of it." She paused. "She didn't know I could hear her." Logan breathed. "What did she say?" "She said you were in trouble." Sophie's voice was carefully neutral. "Are you in trouble, Dad?" "No," he said. And then, because he never lied to her about things that mattered, "Not real trouble. People are saying things that aren't true. It happens sometimes." "Why?" "Because sometimes people want something and they figure out that making someone look bad is easier than earning what they want." She thought about that for a moment with the focused expression she used for hard problems. "That's stupid," she said. "Yeah," Logan said. "It is." He stood up. They walked to the truck. She climbed in and buckled her seatbelt and then said, without looking at him, "You're really good at your job, Dad. I know because you taught me that the way you know someone is good at their job is that the people around them get better too. And Nadia texted to thank you last month and you didn't even notice I saw it." He started the truck. He looked straight ahead for a second. "You pay too much attention," he told her. "You taught me that too," she said. He pulled out of the parking lot. He was quiet most of the way home. Sophie put her headphones on and watched something on her tablet and didn't push him, which was its own kind of grace. That night, after she was asleep, he took the resignation letter out of the drawer and read it again. He added one paragraph. He sealed it in an envelope. He didn't send it yet, but it was ready. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that Marcus Hale's operation had moved into its second phase 3 days earlier, and the second phase was not about documents or articles or anonymous phone calls. The second phase involved a man named Derek Souza, who worked in compliance, who had been quietly modified over 2 years from a competent auditor into something else entirely. Someone who understood that his continued employment and the particular financial arrangements that supplemented his salary depended on his willingness to sign off on things that deserved closer examination. Sousa had been given a package. The package contained fabricated audit flags, 5 of them, each precisely crafted to look like the natural output of a routine review, each pointing toward contract anomalies in the Meridian Initiative that, in isolation, looked like evidence of deliberate manipulation. The flags didn't prove anything. They didn't need to. In the world of corporate governance, an audit flag that doesn't get immediately cleared becomes a stain, and stains have a way of spreading. Sousa filed the flags on a Friday afternoon, when most of the compliance leadership would be already mentally checked out for the weekend. He did not file them with the internal team. He filed them with the external regulatory office. By Monday morning, Winslow Global's legal department had 3 emails from a government compliance liaison asking for documentation related to the Meridian Initiative's contract management. Standard language, routine, the kind of thing that, if handled correctly, would resolve in weeks. Except that by Monday afternoon, someone inside the legal department, someone Logan had never met and whose loyalty ran in directions he didn't understand, had forwarded those emails to a journalist. And by Tuesday morning, there was a new headline. This one didn't dance around implications. Regulatory inquiry opened into Winslow Global Meridian Initiative. Company insider, named and filing. Logan's name was not in the headline. It was in the second paragraph. He read it in his truck, in the parking structure, before he went up to his office. He read it twice, the way he'd read the first one, and then he sat for a moment with the engine off and the particular quiet of an early morning parking garage around him, that echoing specific silence that makes everything feel slightly underwater. Then his phone rang. It was Frank Dooley, his old supervisor from the 3rd floor, who had no reason to be calling him except one. "Logan," Frank said. He sounded uncomfortable in the way decent people sound when they've been asked to do something they think is wrong but can't find a good enough reason to refuse. "I've been asked to let you know that HR wants to meet with you this morning, 9 o'clock, 12th floor. "I'll be there," Logan said. "Logan?" Frank stopped. "It's okay, Frank." "It's not," Frank said quietly, "for what it's worth." Logan thanked him and hung up. The HR meeting was exactly what he'd expected. 2 people from the department, a woman from legal, whose job was to listen and not react, and 40 minutes of careful language that carefully said nothing concrete while making it clear that the company was in the position of needing to manage its exposure. They didn't accuse him of anything. They used phrases like pending review, an appropriate distance from active operations, and temporary administrative adjustment. They told him the Meridian Initiative would be managed by a committee while the inquiry was handled. Logan sat through it with his hands on the table and his face neutral and answered every question directly and did not once perform emotion for their benefit. When it was over, he went back to his office. He sat at his desk and looked at the work on his screen. Supply chain data, delivery reports, the correspondence with aid coordinators that had been building into something real. And he understood that the most honest thing he could do right now was also the hardest. He took the resignation letter out of his briefcase, where he'd moved it that morning. He added Celeste Winslow's name to the top. And then, before he could talk himself out of it, the way reasonable people talk themselves out of the right thing when the right thing is costly, he walked it to her assistant's desk, set it in the tray, and went back downstairs. He did not tell Celeste he was coming. He did not call. He didn't want her to have the chance to stop him before he'd done it, because he knew, with the particular self-awareness of someone who'd had years to learn the difference between what he wanted and what he could afford to want, that if she asked him not to, he might not be strong enough to go through with it. He cared about the work, and he was beginning, despite everything he'd done to prevent it, to care about her. That was exactly why he had to leave. Priya found the envelope in this tray. 17 minutes later, recognized the name on the front, and brought it directly to Celeste's office. Celeste was on a call when Priya came in, a call with 3 board members who wanted to discuss the regulatory inquiry, which was a conversation she'd been managing for 2 days with the careful precision of someone diffusing something without a clear diagram. She looked up when Priya set the envelope on the desk, looked at the name in the return address corner, and felt something land in her chest like a stone. She told the board members she'd call them back. She opened the letter. She read it in less than 2 minutes. It was short. Logan didn't use unnecessary words. He thanked her for the opportunity, noted that the Meridian Initiative documentation was fully organized and accessible for any review, confirmed that his team had the capacity to continue the work without him, and stated that his resignation was effective immediately. The last 2 sentences were the only personal thing in the document, and they were precise enough to be unmistakable. I understand what's happening and why. Leaving is the only thing I can do that protects both you and my daughter, and those are the 2 things I'm not willing to let this reach. Celeste set the letter down. She sat for a moment. Then she stood up, picked up the letter, and walked to the elevator. She found Logan in the parking structure. He was at his truck, key in hand, hadn't yet gotten in. She walked fast, and she didn't care what it looked like or who saw her. Logan. He turned around. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not guarded exactly, but careful in a different way, like someone bracing for something they've already decided to absorb. Don't, she said. Celeste, I'm not accepting it. You don't have a choice, he said. And neither do I. This isn't going away. Whatever they're building, I'm the foundation of it. And if I'm gone, it falls apart. Or it follows you, she said. Have you considered that? He had. The lines around his jaw said he had. That's a risk I can manage outside your company. It's not a risk I can manage inside it without taking you down with me. You don't get to decide what I'm willing to risk, she said. Her voice was sharper than she'd intended. She didn't soften it. You sat in my conference room 8 months ago and told me that being good at something and having it matter covers a lot of ground. You were right. Your work on Meridian covered ground that this company has been promising for years and never delivering. You don't throw that away because someone decided you were a convenient target. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that she couldn't fully decode. Not reluctance exactly, and not calculation. Something more complicated. The look of a man weighing things that couldn't be put on the same scale. Sophie had someone call her school, he said quietly. An anonymous call, implying there was a safety concern. Celeste went very still. They moved from me to her, he said. That changed the calculation. She heard it. She understood it. She also understood with the cold clarity of someone who'd spent years learning to read the spaces between what people said and what they meant. That what Logan Pierce would never say out loud was that Sophie was the only leverage that actually worked on him. Everything else, his reputation, his career, the judgment of strangers, he could weather. But not his daughter. Which meant that whoever was running this operation knew exactly the same thing. Give me 72 hours, she said. Celeste. 72 hours. Don't turn in the badge, don't clear the office, don't tell your team anything. 72 hours. She held his gaze. And I will deal with what this actually is. He looked at her for a long time. The parking structure was quiet around them, early morning light coming in from the ramp at a shallow angle, the sound of distant traffic muffled by concrete. 72 hours, he said finally. After that, I do what I have to do. After that, she said, I'll have done what I have to do. She turned and walked back toward the elevator. Her hands were steady. Her hands were always steady. But in the elevator, alone, she leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for exactly 4 seconds. She had 72 hours, and she already knew they weren't going to be enough to finish this cleanly. She also knew that Marcus Hale had been moving pieces for 3 years, which meant his structure had depth she hadn't fully mapped yet. What she had was a security director who'd been quietly building a file for 11 days, a compliance attorney she trusted with the specific things that mattered, and the instinct, the same instinct that had built the company, that had walked away from the billion-dollar merger, that had sent an envelope to a logistics manager on the 7th floor, that told her she was not wrong about who Logan Pierce was. She was not wrong about who Logan Pierce was. And Marcus Hale had made the mistake, somewhere in his very careful construction, of assuming that she was the kind of person who protected herself first. She went back to her office. She called her security director. "How much do we have?" she asked. "Enough to raise questions," he said. "Not enough to close them." "What do we need?" "Access to Hale's external communications, not company servers. He's careful about that. His personal accounts. We'd need legal authority or he makes a mistake," Celeste said. "That," the security director agreed. "Then we need to give him a reason to make one," she said. She hung up. She looked out her window at the city and thought about Logan reading that resignation letter at his kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night after his daughter was asleep, trying to solve the problem of how to protect two people at the same time when protecting one of them meant leaving the other behind. She thought about the way he'd braced when she came toward him in the parking structure. Not defensively, not with anger, just steadiness. The brace of someone who expected to be hit by something and had already decided they weren't going to fall down. She thought about a 7-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit named Captain Fluffington, who had somehow, without ever meeting Celeste Winslow, become one of the reasons Celeste was willing to burn the next 72 hours doing something she'd never done before in her professional life. She was not going to manage this. She was not going to navigate it or contain it or find a mutually acceptable resolution that preserved relationships and minimized disruption. She was going to end it. She pulled up Marcus Hale's calendar. He had a board dinner on Thursday evening, a quarterly thing, long established, the kind of event where people relaxed slightly because the setting was social and the agenda was food, and the conversations that happened were understood to be off the record. It was the kind of environment where a careful man might say more than he meant to, or be seen with people he'd otherwise prefer not to be seen with. Celeste confirmed her own attendance. Then she called the one board member she trusted completely, a 71-year-old woman named Harriet Blum, who had been on the board since the company's 3rd year, who had seen 4 attempted coups of various kinds in her career, and whose opinion of corporate politics was concise enough to fit on a business card. "Harriet," Celeste said when she picked up, "I need to tell you something." "Then tell me," Harriet said. No preamble, no performance of concern, just the directness of someone who'd learned that time was genuinely finite. Celeste told her. When she finished, Harriet was quiet for a moment. "You should have come to me sooner," she said. "I know. But you're here now." A pause. "Thursday evening. I'll be there, and I'll bring Reeves." A board member, older, meticulous, the kind of person who took notes in a paper notebook and cross-referenced them against the official minutes after every meeting. "If Hale says anything worth catching, between the two of us, we'll catch it." "I need more than catching," Celeste said. "I know what you need," Harriet said. "That's why I said I'd bring Reeves." After the call, Celeste sat in the quiet of her office as the morning moved toward midday. Outside, the city continued its ordinary and different business. Somewhere across town, in a school building, Sophie Pierce was probably eating lunch or learning about ecosystems or drawing velociraptors in the margins of her notebook. Somewhere in this building, Logan Pierce was sitting at his desk doing work that mattered, because that was the only kind of work he knew how to do, counting down 72 hours to a deadline he'd set, because protecting the people he loved was more important to him than anything he wanted for himself. Celeste opened her laptop. She had a board dinner to prepare for, a regulatory inquiry to manage, and a 3-year-old structure of calculated betrayal to dismantle in 72 hours. She'd done harder things. She told herself that with enough conviction that she almost believed it. The 72 hours passed without the clean resolution Celeste had promised, and without the resignation Logan had threatened, which meant they arrived at Thursday evening in a state of armed suspension, both of them moving through their separate days with the careful awareness of people who had made an agreement they weren't sure either of them could keep. The Thursday board dinner was held at the Arden Club, a private venue on the 43rd floor of a building that had been built in an era when architecture still wanted to impress rather than simply function. Dark wood paneling, windows that ran floor to ceiling, a dining room designed for conversations that were supposed to feel informal while being anything but. Celeste had been to this dinner 11 times. She had always found it slightly exhausting in the way that performance always is when you're aware you're performing. Tonight she was not performing. Tonight she was watching. Marcus Hale arrived 20 minutes early, which was itself information. Marcus was never early unless he had a reason to be. He moved through the room with the ease of someone who had decided, at some point in his past, that confidence was a costume that fit well enough to forget he was wearing it. He shook hands. He laughed at the right moments. He touched people's arms when he spoke to them, the way people do when they want you to feel included in something without actually being included. Celeste watched him from across the room and thought about the documents her security director had placed on her desk 2 days earlier. Not enough to close, he'd said. Enough to raise questions. What he'd found was a pattern of communication, phone records, not content, because content required a different level of authority, between Marcus Hale's personal number and 3 external contacts. One of those contacts had a consulting firm that had received referral fees from 2 of the vendors Logan had replaced during the Meridian Initiative restructuring. The replaced vendors. The ones Logan had cut because they were inflating costs. Those vendors had been Marcus's introductions to the company. 4 years ago, before Logan Pierce had ever walked through Winslow Global's doors. The shape of it was clear enough. The evidence was not. Not yet. Harriet Blum arrived at 7:15 wearing the expression she always wore at these events. Polite attention that concealed the fact that she was already several moves ahead of the conversation. She found Celeste near the window. "He's in a good mood," Harriet said quietly, not looking at Marcus. "That's what worries me," Celeste said. "Reeves is here. He's talking to Fontaine right now. I briefed him on the financial thread." Harriet accepted a glass of water from a passing server and did not touch it. "Marcus is going to make a move tonight. People in good moods at events like this are either celebrating something that already happened or something they think is about to." "What makes you think it's tonight?" Harriet looked at her with the patience of someone who had watched 20 years of men like Marcus Hale. "Because your 72 hours are up tomorrow," she said. "And he knows something you don't know yet. I can see it in the way he's standing." Celeste said nothing. She filed that away. The dinner began at 8. 12 people at a long table, the seating arranged with the particular social math of events, where proximity is a kind of message. Celeste had been placed at the center, which was her usual position. Marcus was 3 seats to her right, which put him close enough for conversation and far enough to avoid the appearance of deliberate positioning. The first hour was ordinary. Industry talk, a discussion about regulatory trends in Southeast Asian markets that Celeste contributed to with exactly enough engagement to not seem distracted. She ate without tasting anything. She listened to everything. It happened during the dessert course, when the table had loosened into the smaller conversations that develop when people have had enough wine to stop being entirely careful. Marcus was talking to Fontaine, a board member who controlled a significant equity position and whose support Marcus had been cultivating for 2 years. Celeste caught fragments, not enough. The table noise covered most of it, but she caught the words exposure and transition period, and then something that made her set down her fork. The regulatory filing will complete the picture by Monday. She didn't react. She picked her fork back up. She turned to the person on her left and asked a question about supply chain trends in the European market that she did not remotely care about, and listened to the answer with apparent interest. Under the table, she sent a text to her security director. 4 words. Monday. Regulatory. More coming. His response came in under a minute. Already on it. Call me after. The dinner ended at 10:30. Celeste said the right things to the right people and put Marcus Hale in a cab with a smile that she'd spent 30 years practicing. In the lobby, Harriet appeared beside her. "Fontaine," Harriet said. "I know. He's been talking to Marcus for 6 months. I've been watching." "I need to know what they're filing Monday," Celeste said. "Then you need what I have," Harriet said. She opened her evening bag and removed a folded piece of paper. Actual paper, handwritten, the old-fashioned kind of evidence that doesn't exist in a server. "Reeves keeps notes at every board meeting. He's been doing it for 9 years. He showed me something interesting last week." She handed over the paper. 2 years ago, Marcus proposed an internal restructuring of the Meridian Initiative's vendor management. It was voted down, barely, 4-3. Reeves has the exact language Marcus used in that proposal. Celeste unfolded the paper and read. The language was specific enough to matter. Marcus had proposed 2 years before Logan Pierce had ever touched the Meridian Initiative, a framework that would have placed vendor selection authority with the vice chairman's office rather than with the program lead. When the proposal failed, he'd moved on, or appeared to. What he'd actually done, the paper suggested, was build the same structure informally, through the vendor relationships he already controlled and through the regulatory leverage he'd apparently been positioning for months. Logan hadn't stumbled into a trap. The trap had been built before Logan existed in the picture. When Logan arrived and started dismantling exactly the structure Marcus had spent years constructing, it had been inevitable. He was going to do this to whoever I put in that role, Celeste said. Yes, Harriet said. Logan Pierce was convenient, a man with a complicated background, no influential network, a reason to want proximity to someone powerful. He was cast, Harriet said, choosing the word carefully, into a role that fit the narrative Marcus needed. Celeste stood in the lobby with a piece of paper in her hand and understood, with a precision that felt almost physical, the full weight of what had been done. Not just to the company, not just to her. To a man who'd spent 2 years doing work that genuinely mattered, who'd spent every morning driving his daughter to school and every evening helping her with homework about ecosystems, and never asked for anything from anyone because asking wasn't something he'd learned to do. I need this in front of the compliance attorney tonight, she said. I assumed you would, Harriet said. I already called him. They went into separate cars. Celeste was on the phone for the next 4 hours. She didn't sleep. What happened next arrived sideways, the way the worst things always do. On a Saturday night when Celeste was in her office at 9:30, because she'd been there since 6 and hadn't noticed the time, working through the documentation her compliance attorney had identified as potentially actionable. The charity gala had been on the calendar for 3 months. The Meridian Foundation's annual fundraiser, which this year was being held at the Hargrove Center downtown, a building whose primary architectural feature was a glass atrium the size of a small aircraft hangar. 1,200 attendees, investors, politicians, humanitarian organization representatives, a handful of journalists, and a larger handful of people who simply had enough money to buy their way into the room. It was the highest profile event Winslow Global had hosted in 2 years. Logan had built the program being celebrated at the event. I was attending as a guest, not as an employee. Celeste had insisted on that quietly, through channels she trusted. Whatever happened with his employment status, she was not going to let the work he'd done be quietly erased from its own celebration. He'd arrived with Sophie, an exception, because Sophie had begged, and Logan had never successfully said no to a request made with the combination of reasonable argument and puppy eyes that his daughter had weaponized before she turned 4. Sophie was wearing a dress that Logan had bought at a department store the previous weekend, dark blue, which she'd selected herself and then immediately got a small stain on the hem during dinner beforehand. She'd been distressed about the stain for approximately 4 minutes and then forgotten it entirely. Celeste had seen them arrive from across the atrium. Logan in a suit that fit better than she'd expected, Sophie with her hand in his, already scanning the room with the focused curiosity of a child who treats a new environment as data to be collected. She'd thought about going over. She'd been pulled away by a conversation with the senator before she got the chance. The atrium was at full capacity by 8 o'clock. At 8:47, the lights went out. Not a power fluctuation. Not the gradual dimming of a technical issue. Full darkness, instantaneous, the kind that only happens when someone cuts something deliberately. For a half second, the room was completely black and completely silent, and then everything started at once. Voices, phone flashlights blinking on, the sharp intake of sound from 1,200 people registering that something was wrong. Logan registered it differently. In the dark half second before the phone lights came on, something clicked into place in his nervous system that hadn't been engaged in years. A kind of wholesale sensory recalibration that he'd spent a long time after his discharge trying to convince himself he didn't need anymore. He wasn't thinking in the way that people describe thinking. He was processing the layout of the room as he'd registered it during the previous 40 minutes. The exits he'd noted without meaning to because that's what he did in any space. The weight of Sophie's hand and her current position relative to him, the direction from which the first sound of confusion was loudest. His hand found Sophie's shoulder in the dark. "Stay right here," he said, close to her ear, low and firm. "Don't move until I say." "Dad, I've got you. Don't move." The phone lights came on. In the fragmented illumination, dozens of small white beams moving in different directions, Logan saw 3 things nearly simultaneously. The first was that the venue's security team was not moving with the coordinated response of people who drilled for this. They were reacting, which was different and worse. The second was that 3 of the large service doors along the north wall, which were supposed to be accessible only to staff, had opened. The third was that the people coming through those doors were not staff. They were dressed in event service uniforms. But they moved wrong, too fast, too purposeful, with the specific economy of motion that Logan recognized from training environments and from places he'd been sent to that he never discussed. These were not panicking civilians. These were people with a target. He scanned the room, found Celeste 30 feet away, near the main stage, caught in the press of people trying to understand what was happening. Her security detail, 2 people, both of whom were now dealing with the crowd rather than her, had been effectively separated from her by the confusion. He picked Sophie up. She weighed 54 pounds and had not been picked up like this in 2 years, and her immediate instinct was to protest. "Dad, I'm not—" "Hold on," he said. He moved through the crowd at an angle, using the gaps that opened as people shifted, reading the room in the way he'd learned to read rooms where the stakes of misreading were absolute. He got to Sophie to a pillar near the east wall, structural, solid, set back enough from the main floor to be out of the primary line of movement. He looked at her directly. "Listen to me," he said. "I need you to stay here, right here, behind this pillar, low. There are people coming in who don't belong here. I need to go help someone, and I need to know you're safe while I do." Sophie's face was pale and completely still. She was scared. He could see it. She was also her mother's daughter, and Dana had never once let fear make her stupid. "Who do you need to help?" Sophie asked. "Miss Winslow." A beat. "Okay," Sophie said. "Go." He looked at her for exactly 1 second longer than he could afford to. "I'll be right back." "You'd better," she said, and pulled herself smaller behind the pillar with the deliberate competence of a child who had decided to do exactly what she was told. He went. The crowd was moving in the wrong direction, toward the main exits, which were north and west, which was where the intruders had entered. Logan moved east. He found a service corridor access panel he'd registered on his first circuit of the room, used his event credentials badge to get through. The electronic system was still running on backup power, which meant whoever had cut the main power knew enough to take it partially and not entirely, preserving the look of an accident rather than a coordinated cut. That told him something about the level of planning. He emerged into a service corridor that ran the length of the atrium's east side. Utility lighting only, amber emergency strips at floor level, enough to move by. He oriented himself by the building layout he'd internalized during his walkthrough 3 hours earlier, when the venue staff had been setting up, and he'd helped reorganize the East Wing table configuration because the original setup blocked a fire egress that the venue coordinator hadn't noticed. He'd noticed. He came out through a second access point near the back of the main stage. Celeste was 15 feet away. Her security detail, one of them now, was trying to move her toward the north exit, which was exactly the wrong direction. The detail was a competent man who'd done his job correctly all evening and was now operating on protocols designed for the wrong kind of emergency. Pierce. Celeste saw him before he reached her. Her voice was controlled in the way someone's voice is controlled when they are genuinely frightened and genuinely refusing to show it. "What's happening?" "Organized entry, north and west. We go east." He reached them, looked at the detail. A man named Garrett, who he'd seen around the building and had a fast read on as competent. "Override the protocol. East corridor. Service route. North exit is compromised." Garrett looked at him for about 1 second. "Copy," Garrett said. "Lead." They moved. The east corridor was longer than the alternatives, but it had 2 advantages. It was away from the primary movement of the crowd, which meant less friction, and it gave Logan a view through 2 consecutive window panels of what was happening in the main atrium. What he saw told him that the primary objective was not mass disruption. 3 of the intruders were pushing toward the event's tech station, the AV and data management hub where the Foundation's presentation materials were running, which was also the node through which Winslow Global's encrypted event network was operating. They were after files. He put that together in the time it took them to cover the first 40 feet of the corridor. "The data station," he said to Celeste without slowing. "That's the target. Do you have any of the encrypted asset files on the event network?" A pause that told him the answer before she said it. "The Meridian Initiative documentation. The full operational archive. Her voice was flat in a way that meant she was processing rather than panicking. We moved it to the event server for the Foundation presentation. Who knew that? Another pause, shorter this time. Marcus, she said. They didn't say anything else about it. The east corridor led out through a fire door into a service stairwell that connected to the building's loading dock level. Logan pushed through first, cleared it. Empty. Utility lighting. The sound of distant sirens already beginning through the concrete walls, and held the door for Celeste and Garrett. Law enforcement is going to be here in under 8 minutes, Logan said. We need the building in a status where they can work when they arrive. Garrett, can you reach your team lead? Garrett checked his radio. Patchy, I've got Romero. Get Romero. North exit, coordinate to push the crowd back east. Tell them the north and west points are active entry. They need to stop funneling people into those zones. He looked at the man directly. Can you do that from here? Yeah. Go. Garrett went back through the door. Logan looked at Celeste. She was standing in the industrial quiet of a loading dock stairwell in a dress that probably cost more than his monthly salary, and she was looking at him with an expression that wasn't fear and wasn't relief and wasn't something he had a clean category for. She looked, he thought, like someone who had spent a long time being the most capable person in any room and had just encountered a situation where that wasn't sufficient and had made peace with it faster than most people could. Sophie, he said. She's safe? East Pillar. She knows to stay put. He checked his watch. 6 minutes until law enforcement establishes perimeter. The files are already compromised or they're not, he said. There's nothing we can do about that from here. What matters now is that we get you out of this building without anyone using you as secondary leverage. He met her eyes. They came for the files, but if they can walk out with you, that's the better outcome for whoever sent them. She heard that. Okay, she said. What do we do? We stay here until I hear sirens close enough to mean they're inside the building. Then we go back up through the service stair, find Sophie, and come out the East Street access with everyone else. He paused. I need you to trust me for about 5 more minutes. I already trust you, she said. It came out simply. Not performed. Not the kind of thing said to manage a moment. The kind of thing said because it was accurate, and the situation didn't leave room for anything less than accuracy. He didn't answer it. He stood by the door and listened. 4 minutes and 40 seconds later, the sirens were close enough. They went back up. Sophie was exactly where he'd left her, behind the east pillar, arms around her knees, watching the diminishing chaos of the atrium with the expression of someone filing information for later. When Logan came through the service door, her face did something complex. Relief, followed immediately by the performance of having not been scared, which was undermined completely by the fact that she stood up so fast she nearly knocked herself over. He got to her in 4 steps and crouched down. I'm here, he said. She grabbed him, arms around his neck, her whole small weight forward. She didn't say anything for a moment, and he let her not say anything. The lady, Sophie said into his shoulder. Is she okay? She's right here, Logan said. Sophie pulled back and looked. Celeste was standing 4 feet away, and the expression on her face in that moment was something she would never have described accurately, even if someone had asked her to. The sight of a 7-year-old in a blue dress with a stained hem holding onto her father's neck with everything she had, in the middle of an atrium full of police response teams and frightened people and the wreckage of a meticulously planned attack, it moved something in Celeste that hadn't been moved in years, possibly ever. Hi, Sophie, she said. Sophie looked at her with the assessing directness that children have before they learn to sand it down into social acceptability. Did my dad help you? Yes, Celeste said. He did. Sophie seemed to consider that. Then she nodded with the gravity of someone officially closing a matter. Good, she said. He's really good at that. The next 2 hours were managed chaos. Law enforcement secured the building in stages. 4 of the intruders were apprehended inside. 3 more were taken at the perimeter as they attempted to leave via a service vehicle. The data station had been partially accessed, enough to raise the question of what had been taken. But the full Meridian archive had triggered an automatic encryption lockdown when the unauthorized access attempt began, a security feature that Celeste's technology team had installed 8 months earlier and that Marcus Hale apparently hadn't known about. The files were intact. What was not intact was the operation Marcus Hale had spent 3 years building. The arrested men were professionals, not amateurs, not opportunists. They were the kind of people who worked for the kind of money that required explanation, and under the pressure of a federal criminal investigation that opened within 48 hours, they began providing that explanation in the careful, qualified way of people whose lawyers had told them that cooperation was their best available option. The name they provided eventually, through those careful qualifications, was not Marcus Hale's name directly, but it connected to a consulting arrangement, which connected to a financial structure, which connected to one of the 3 external contacts from Marcus's phone records that Celeste's security director had flagged. It was, her attorney told her, a thread. A thread was enough. On Sunday morning, 2 days after the gala, Celeste sat in her office, which was now also a temporary operational center for the legal and compliance team working the investigation, and read a document her attorney had prepared summarizing the evidence architecture as it currently stood. It was not simple. It was not clean. It had the particular messiness of real wrongdoing, which almost never presents itself in the linear narrative shape that people expect from movies, and which requires an enormous amount of patient work to assemble into something a prosecutor can actually use. But it was real. The structure was there. Marcus Hale had been using his position to maintain vendor relationships that financially benefited him through intermediary companies. When Logan Pierce had been assigned to the Meridian Initiative and began systematically replacing those vendors with more efficient alternatives, Marcus had first tried to reassign the project and failed, then had constructed a narrative designed to remove Logan while framing the removal as a compliance issue rather than a power play. The regulatory filing he'd planned for Monday, the one she'd overheard at the board dinner, had been the intended final step, the move designed to attach Logan's name to a formal investigation that would have made his continued employment untenable and his departure appear entirely legitimate. The gala attack had not been Marcus's primary plan. It had been, her security director believed, a secondary operation, someone else's hand, possibly hired by one of the external contacts in ways that Marcus had approved but kept at arm's length. The target was the Meridian archive, which contained the full documentation of every contract decision Logan had made. Documentation that, in the wrong hands and with the wrong presentation, could have been used to construct a more damaging version of the financial narrative. They had wanted the files because the files told the truth, and the truth was the problem. She thought about that for a while. The specific absurdity of it, that all of this, the articles, the regulatory pressure, the anonymous school calls, a coordinated operation requiring significant resources and planning, had been fundamentally about making sure the truth didn't get to exist as evidence. She called Logan on Sunday afternoon. He answered on the second ring. She could hear in the background the sound of cartoons and Sophie negotiating about something related to breakfast food. "How is she?" Celeste asked. "Better than me, honestly," Logan said, and she heard, in the slight rough edge of his voice, that he hadn't slept much either. "She's decided the whole thing was an adventure. I'm still working through that assessment." "And you?" A pause that wasn't quite silence. Sophie was in the background, a running commentary about something cartoon-related. "I'm okay," he said. It sounded mostly true. "I need to meet with you tomorrow," she said. "Not about work. About what we have." "The investigation." "Yes. And other things." Another pause. Longer. Breathing, and the cartoon sounds, and the ordinary, impossible smallness of a Sunday morning in someone's kitchen. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally. She wasn't sure exactly what he meant by that, and she was also sure enough about what he meant that she didn't need to ask. "I know," she said. After she hung up, she sat for a while in the quiet of her office. Outside, the city was doing its Sunday business, slower, softer, the particular weekend rhythm of a place that had somewhere else to be. She had a dozen things requiring her attention, and she sat still for a few minutes more anyway. She thought about the way he'd moved in that building, not dramatically, not the way it happens in the kind of movie where the hero takes a moment to look heroic, just efficiently. Just one thing after another, each decision building on the last, no wasted motion and no performance. She thought about what it must have cost him to put Sophie behind that pillar and walk away. She thought about the fact that he'd done it without hesitation because he'd already weighed it and knew what had to be done. She thought about what it meant to know, with real certainty, what kind of person someone was. It was a different kind of wealth than anything she'd built. It was the kind that didn't appear on any balance sheet and couldn't be manufactured and was almost impossible to find. She'd found it, almost literally, by accident on a concrete divider on Hargrove Avenue. And then someone had spent 3 years trying to take it away from her. Not because they knew what it meant to her, but because they understood it was leverage. They'd been wrong about that. Leverage only works on people who are afraid to lose something. Celeste was not afraid anymore. She was, if anything, the opposite of afraid. She was the specific kind of focus that comes after fear has been metabolized into clarity, when you know exactly what you're protecting and exactly what you're willing to do. Marcus Hale's world, the one he'd built over 6 years inside her company, was going to come apart. She was going to make sure of it. She picked up her phone and called her attorney. "Tell me what we need to do Monday," she said. And they got to work. Monday arrived with the particular weight of days that have been anticipated for so long they feel almost anticlimactic when they finally appear. Marcus Hale came into the building at 8:43, which was his usual time, wearing his usual charcoal suit, carrying the leather portfolio he brought to every meeting as though the physical object conferred authority. He stopped at his assistant's desk, collected his messages, made a comment about the weekend traffic that his assistant laughed at, with the practiced ease of someone who'd been laughing at the same quality of joke for 3 years. Then he walked toward his office. Celeste's compliance attorney, 2 federal investigators, and a representative from the company's external audit firm were waiting inside it. Marcus stopped in the doorway. He looked at the room. He looked at the faces. And Celeste, who was standing to the left of the door where he couldn't see her until he'd already fully committed to entering, watched the precise moment when Marcus Hale understood that the structure he had spent 3 years building had not simply failed. It had been used against him. Every document, every financial thread, every carefully maintained arm's-length arrangement had been followed back to its origin with the patience of people who had the time and the authority and the specific motivation that comes from knowing exactly what you're looking for. "Marcus," Celeste said. He turned. Something moved through his face that, not panic, because Marcus was too controlled for panic, but the rapid internal recalculation of someone whose model of the situation has just been revealed as entirely wrong. "Celeste," his voice was level, remarkably level. "I think I'm going to need to call my attorney." "That's your right," she said, "but I'd like to say one thing first." He waited. "You built something very careful," she said. "The vendor relationships, the regulatory pathway, the media contacts, the compliance angle. It was, architecturally, it was impressive. You understood how the pieces needed to connect to look like something other than what they were." She paused. "You made one miscalculation." He looked at her with the expression of someone who doesn't want to ask but can't stop themselves. "What was that?" "You thought the goal was to protect myself," she said. "It wasn't." She stepped aside. Marcus Hale was escorted from the building at 9:17. His assistant stood at her desk and watched him go with an expression that was impossible to read. The office floor went quiet in the specific way that spaces go quiet, when something large has shifted and everyone can feel it, but nobody is ready to say it out loud yet. Celeste went back to her office. She had 14 things requiring immediate attention, and she dealt with them one at a time, in order, without drama. By noon she had spoken to the board, to the legal team coordinating with the federal investigators, and to the PR firm that was preparing a public statement carefully calibrated to be accurate without being inflammatory. She had not yet spoken to Logan. He was in the building. She knew that because Priya had confirmed it, because Logan Pierce was the kind of person who came to work during a corporate crisis, even when that work was technically in a state of administrative suspension, because the administrative suspension had been part of a fabricated process that was now being officially unwound. He'd come in, and he'd gone to the 7th floor, and he'd sat at his desk and worked on the Meridian documentation, which was what he'd been doing every day since the gala, because there were aid distribution timelines that didn't pause for corporate investigations and communities in 3 countries that were depending on logistics coordination that would fall apart if he stopped paying attention. She went to find him at 12:30. He was at his desk with his lunch, a sandwich he'd brought from home because Logan Pierce did not order lunch delivery, which she'd learned was both a budget decision and a preference, open beside his keyboard, eating with one hand and reviewing supply chain reports with the other. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "It's done?" he asked. "He's out of the building. The investigators have what they need to proceed." Logan nodded. He looked back at his screen briefly, then closed the report he'd been reading with the deliberate attention of someone setting a task down properly rather than abandoning it. "How bad is it?" "For the company? Manageable. The financial exposure from his vendor arrangements will take months to fully quantify, but the structure of the business is sound." She sat down in the chair across from his desk, the same configuration as the conference room where they'd first talked, except that this was his space, which felt different. "For Marcus personally, it's bad. The federal involvement complicates things in ways I can't predict." "He built it over 3 years," Logan said. "Not with satisfaction, just as an observation, the way he registered most things." "At least that long," Celeste said. "Probably started the first year. The vendor relationships predate the Meridian Initiative by 4 years. And the files from the gala, intact, the encryption lockdown held." She looked at him. "They didn't get what they came for." He absorbed that. "Derek Souza," he said, "the compliance auditor who filed the flags. He's cooperating with investigators. He had a secondary income arrangement that's going to complicate his life significantly." She paused. "He filed those flags because Marcus told him the regulatory inquiry would be resolved quickly and Souza's involvement would disappear. He believed it because he needed to believe it." "People usually do," Logan said. She looked at him for a moment. He was sitting in his office chair with his half-eaten sandwich beside him and 3 weeks of fabricated professional jeopardy behind him, and he looked tired. Not broken, not bitter, just the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent a long time holding steady against something that didn't deserve the effort it required. "I need to make a public statement about you," she said, "about what actually happened. The full picture, your record on the Meridian Initiative, the nature of the fabricated evidence, the regulatory filing that was being prepared. The journalists who ran those stories are going to want a response, and I intend to give them one." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't need a public statement." "I know you don't need it," she said. "Sophie's school needs it. The record needs it. The people who read those articles and formed an opinion about who you are need it." She held his gaze. "And I need it. Because I was the person who put you in that role, and I'm the one whose company was used to damage you, and I am not going to let that stand uncorrected." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, just the small internal movement of a person accepting something they'd been prepared to refuse. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She stood up, started toward the door, stopped. "Logan." She turned back. He was looking at her. "Thank you. For the gala. For Sophie staying behind the pillar. For all of it." He shook his head slightly. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." She left. She was almost back to the elevator when she heard him say, behind her, just barely loud enough to carry, "Celeste." She turned around. He was standing in his office doorway now, hands in his pockets, the lunch he'd interrupted still half-eaten on his desk behind him. "For what it's worth," he said. 72 hours was enough. She almost smiled. It was close. It was always going to be close, he said, but it was enough. She got in the elevator. The public statement went out at 3 o'clock. It was precise and comprehensive and left no interpretive room. It named the fabricated evidence, outlined the nature of the conspiracy, confirmed Logan Pierce's record on the Meridian Initiative as entirely legitimate and fully documented, and noted that every promotion he had received had been based on performance assessments that were now available for independent review. It did not use the word vindication because Celeste didn't deal in dramatic vocabulary. It simply stated what was true and put it in front of the same audience that had seen the alternative version. By evening, 3 of the journalists who had run the original stories had published corrections. The 4th was still deciding, which her PR firm told her was a decision that would resolve itself in 24 hours given the comprehensiveness of the documentation. The Regulatory Liaison Office contacted Winslow Global's legal department to officially close the inquiry. Logan found out about the corrections when Nadia texted him 7 exclamation marks in a row, which was not her usual register, followed by a link and the message, "They took it back. They actually took it back." He read the correction on his phone in the parking structure at 6:15, waiting for his truck to warm up. He read it twice, the same way he'd read the original article, carefully, all the way through, without reaction. Then he put his phone in his pocket and drove to pick up Sophie. She was in the after-school program, working on something art-related that had covered her hands in blue paint, which she displayed for him the moment he walked in with the cheerful exhibition of someone proud of an achievement rather than embarrassed by a mess. "It's a mural," she said, "about ecosystems." "Whose idea?" "Mine and Mr. Alderman's. He said ecosystems were the theme of the week, and I said that was also the theme of real life, and he said I should make something about it." She held up her hands again for better viewing. "The blue is ocean." "It's very blue," Logan said. "Oceans are very blue," Sophie said, as though this were a logical inevitability rather than an art choice. He drove home with the radio off and Sophie explaining the ecosystem's mural in detail and the particular quiet in his chest of someone who had come through something and was still sorting out what the other side of it felt like. It didn't feel triumphant. It didn't feel like victory the way victory was supposed to feel. It felt like relief that had been so long in arriving that it had lost some of its shape. He made dinner. Sophie set the table and narrated the rest of her school day, which involved a disagreement about the rules of Foursquare that she'd resolved through what she described as negotiation, and what Logan suspected was the specific stubbornness she'd inherited from him, applied at sufficient volume to produce consensus. He let her talk. He listened to all of it. After dinner, while she was in the bath, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the quiet of the apartment around him and thought about what happened next. Not the investigation, that would move through its legal process at the pace legal processes move, which was slow and was not his to manage. Not the company. Celeste would handle what needed handling, and the Meridian Initiative would continue because the work was real, regardless of the politics that had been built around it. He thought about the less structured question, the one that didn't have a procedural answer. He was 32 years old. He had a 7-year-old daughter who thought ecosystems were the theme of real life and who had spent a Saturday night behind a pillar in a dark atrium and had come out of it with her equilibrium substantially intact, which was both a testament to her character and a thing that still made his stomach tighten when he thought about it too directly. He had a job he was good at and work that mattered, and a series of memories from the past several months that had reorganized themselves into something he hadn't planned for and wasn't sure what to do about. He thought about a woman who had walked a federal investigator through 6 years of financial documentation without sleeping and then shown up in his office doorway at 12:30 to tell him it was over and to thank him, in the specific way that some people thank you, not as social performance, but as a genuine transfer of weight from one person to another. He thought about the parking structure, about the way she'd said I already trust you in the concrete and utility light quiet of a loading dock stairwell with complete absence of strategy. He was still sitting at the table when Sophie appeared in her pajamas, hair damp, Captain Fluffington under her arm. "You're thinking again," she said. "I'm allowed to think." "You have the look," she said. She climbed into the chair across from him, which she wasn't technically supposed to do in pajamas because of the homework rule, but he didn't say anything about it. She put the rabbit on the table between them and regarded her father with the focused assessment of someone conducting an evaluation. "What look?" he asked. "The one where you're thinking about something that matters, but you don't know if it's okay to want it." She said this with complete matter-of-factness, as though she were identifying a weather pattern. Logan looked at his daughter for a moment. "When did you get so specific?" "You taught me to be specific," she said. "You said vague thinking leads to vague outcomes." "I said that about logistics planning." "It's the same thing," Sophie said. She picked up Captain Fluffington and straightened his ear, which immediately flopped back to its usual angle. "Is the thinking about Ms. Winslow?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. Sophie nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone processing significant data. "I like her," she said. "She's not fake. Some adults are fake with kids because they think we can't tell, but we can always tell. She's not like that." She looked at him. She was scared at the gala, but she didn't act stupid because of it. "No," Logan said. She didn't. "That's important," Sophie said. "Being scared and not letting it make you stupid." "It is," he agreed. Sophie was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm and the apartment was settling into its nighttime sounds, and Captain Fluffington sat on the table between them with his lopsided ear and his gas station origins and his 7 years of accumulated importance. Dad, Sophie said, is it okay if I hope something? Depends on what you're hoping. That things get bigger, she said. Our life, I mean. Like, bigger. More people in it. She wasn't quite looking at him. She was looking at the rabbit. It's been really good. Just us. I know that. But I think it might be good with more too. She glanced up. Is that okay to hope? Logan looked at his daughter for a long moment. She was 7 years old and she had her mother's directness and her father's ability to sit with a hard thing until she understood its actual shape. And she was asking him a question that was not about permission and was not about approval. It was about whether he was carrying the same hope she was, and whether they were carrying it in the same direction. Yeah, he said. That's okay to hope. Sophie nodded, satisfied. She picked up the rabbit and stood. Okay, I'm going to bed. I'll be in to say goodnight. She was halfway to the hallway when she stopped. Dad, the thing you're not sure if it's okay to want. Yeah, it's okay, she said simply. Then she went to her room. He sat at the table for a while after. The coffee had gone cold, and the apartment was quiet, and the conversation had done what the best conversations do. Not answered the question exactly, but clarified what the question actually was. He wasn't afraid of what he wanted. He'd never been afraid of it, not exactly. He was afraid of what it cost. The cost to Sophie of introducing something into their life that might not hold. The cost to Celeste of being loved by someone who came with complications, and a 7-year-old and 12 recipes in rotation, and a deep structural inability to perform emotions he didn't actually have. But Sophie had said, it's okay, and Sophie, despite being 7, had a better calibration of what was actually fine than most adults he'd encountered. He washed his coffee cup, said goodnight to his daughter, turned off the kitchen light. He did not call Celeste that night, but he thought about calling her, which was its own kind of beginning. The weeks that followed had the specific texture of aftermath, not resolution exactly, because resolution in real life is rarely a single moment, but the gradual, uneven process of things settling into their new configurations. The federal investigation moved forward at its bureaucratic pace. The Meridian Initiative was officially reinstated under Logan's leadership, with a formal acknowledgement from the board that the administrative suspension had been the result of fabricated compliance flags. Nadia cried when she found out, briefly and fiercely, and then immediately pulled up her project files and started working. Derek Souza resigned. The 3 executives who had been part of Marcus's informal loyalty structure were placed on administrative review pending the investigation's findings. 2 of them retained attorneys within 48 hours, which told Celeste's legal team what it needed to know about the degree of their involvement. Fontaine, the board member Marcus had been cultivating, resigned from the board voluntarily and without drama, which was what happened when someone with significant resources decided the cost of staying was greater than the cost of leaving. Harriet Blum was elected to fill the chair position on an interim basis. I'm too old for this, Harriet said when Celeste called to tell her. You're exactly the right age for this, Celeste said. That's diplomatically stated, Harriet said. It's also probably true. A pause. How are you, Celeste? And I mean actually, not the managed version. Celeste was at her desk. Outside the window, the city was doing its early evening thing, the shift from work light to after-work light, the particular gold of late afternoon on glass buildings. Tired, she said honestly, and better than I've been in a long time. Both of those things at the same time. That's usually what genuine change feels like, Harriet said. The change Celeste was thinking about was not only the company. She called Logan on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after Marcus Hale's departure from the building. Sophie answered, which was unexpected. She'd apparently gotten hold of her father's phone during dinner and answered it because, as she explained without preamble, her dad had spaghetti sauce on his hands. This is Sophie, she announced. Hi, Sophie, Celeste said. This is Celeste. Is your dad available? He's washing his hands. He made spaghetti. A pause. He makes it every Tuesday and Thursday. It's one of his 12 recipes. He told you about the 12 recipes? He didn't have to, Sophie said. I counted. Celeste found herself smiling at her office window. You're very observant. Dad says that's a skill, not just a personality thing. I think your dad's right about a lot of things. Yeah, Sophie said, with the equanimity of someone who has arrived at this conclusion independently and is satisfied to have it confirmed. There was a brief sound of shuffling, and then Logan's voice came on. "Sorry," he said. "Spaghetti situation." "Tuesday and Thursday," Celeste said. A beat. She counted. "She told me." He laughed. It was a real one. Brief, slightly surprised at itself. The kind that didn't perform anything. She stored it away without meaning to, the way you store things you don't want to lose. "Are you free Saturday?" she asked. Not for anything formal. Sophie mentioned she wanted to see the Natural History Museum's new exhibit, the one about prehistoric marine ecosystems. "She's been talking about that for 3 weeks," Logan said. "I thought the three of us could go," Celeste said. If that works?" A pause. Not hesitation exactly. More like the pause of someone making sure they were saying yes for the right reasons rather than the convenient ones. "That works," he said. "Good," she said. They went on Saturday. It was not a perfect day. Sophie argued about wearing her coat for the first 20 minutes. They got turned around finding the parking entrance, and the museum was more crowded than any of them had anticipated, which meant navigating the prehistoric marine exhibit required a patience for slow movement that Celeste had to consciously practice. Sophie was in front of every display for longer than the posted crowd guidelines recommended, reading everything, asking questions of a depth that impressed 2 actual museum employees who stopped to answer her and ended up in an impromptu 15-minute conversation about Cambrian ocean ecosystems. Logan stood back slightly and let Sophie lead, which Celeste watched and understood as a practiced art, the specific skill of a parent who'd learned the difference between guiding and directing. He was good at it in the way he was good at most things, not effortlessly, but through the kind of attention that looks like ease from a distance. She found herself beside him at one point, both of them watching Sophie crouch in front of a fossilized ammonite display and explain something to a smaller child who had wandered over and seemed confused about what they were looking at. "She's going to be a scientist," Celeste said. "Or a diplomat," Logan said. "She's explaining a 400-million-year-old ocean creature to a 4-year-old, and the 4-year-old is completely engaged. That's diplomacy in science." "Yeah," he said. "Dana was like that. Could talk to anyone." He said it easily, without the weight that those sentences sometimes carry, just factually, the way you mention someone who is genuinely still present even in absence. Sophie got that part from her. Celeste didn't say anything for a moment. "What did Sophie get from you?" He thought about it honestly. "The stubbornness," he said. "The need to understand how things actually work. The inability to leave a problem unfinished. Those aren't bad things to inherit." "Depends on the day," he said. Sophie had moved on to the next display, dragging the 4-year-old gently by the hand with the authority of someone who has appointed themselves an official guide. The 4-year-old's parent followed, looking grateful. "I need to tell you something," Logan said. "Okay." He was looking at the fossil display rather than at her. "When I wrote the resignation letter, the part about protecting you and Sophie both, that was true. It was true, and it was also—" He paused, found the word. It was convenient. Leaving was the right thing, and it was also the easier thing, in a specific way, because it meant I didn't have to figure out what to do with— He stopped again. She waited. "With what this is," he said. He turned and looked at her then, not with the careful composure he usually kept assembled between himself and whatever he was actually feeling, but with the slightly undefended expression of someone who has decided that the armor is more expensive than the thing it's protecting. "I know what this is," Celeste said. "I know you do," he said. "I'm telling you I know it too, and that I'm—" Another pause. He was not, she had noticed, a man who filled pauses with anything. He let them sit until he had the right word. "I'm not running from it anymore." She looked at him for a moment. "Good," she said. Sophie reappeared. "There's a whole section about prehistoric sharks," she announced. "We have to go right now." They went. The months that followed were not a montage. They were specific and imperfect and sometimes logistically complicated. 3 people with 3 separate lives finding the rhythm of what it meant to exist in each other's orbit with increasing regularity. Celeste learned that Logan's apartment had a kitchen table that was slightly uneven on one leg, and that he'd shimmed it with a folded piece of cardboard rather than replacing it, which she found funny and he found practical. He learned that she had genuinely never learned to cook in any functional sense, and that her first attempt at Sophie's requested chocolate chip pancakes produced something that was technically edible and dramatically incorrect in shape. Sophie ate all of them and told her they were good, which Celeste recognized as kindness rather than accuracy, and appreciated more for that reason. There were school pickup days when Celeste came instead of Logan because the Meridian Initiative had a coordination crisis that needed his attention, and she'd offered without being asked, and she sat in the parking lot at Millhaven Elementary in a car that cost more than most people's annual salaries and waited for a 7-year-old who came out with her backpack half unzipped, which Celeste was learning was a permanent condition rather than an occasional one. They went for ice cream. Sophie got pistachio, which she described as the intellectual choice, and told Celeste about a book she was reading about deep-sea creatures. Celeste read the same book over the following 2 weekends so she could discuss it with her. Logan found out about this through Sophie and didn't say anything about it directly, but something changed in the way he looked at Celeste after that. Not dramatically, not suddenly. Just a small, genuine shift, the kind that happens when someone does a thing they didn't have to do and you understand for the first time that they're going to keep doing things they don't have to do. Not because they're performing something, but because that's actually who they are. It was a Thursday evening in March, about 4 months after the gala, when Celeste came for dinner. Spaghetti, because it was Thursday. And they'd eaten, and Sophie had gone to do homework, and Logan and Celeste were doing the dishes in the kitchen, which was a thing that had developed into a routine without being discussed as such. And the radio was playing something low from the counter, and the kitchen was warm. "The foundation is ready to go public," Celeste said. She was drying a bowl. "The charitable structure. Military families, widowed parents, children's education. The legal team finished the framework last week." "I know," he said. Nadia briefed the Meridian team on the integration. "I want you to run it," she said. He stopped washing, looked at her. "The foundation. Director of Operations. You'd have full authority over program design, not just logistics. The work you did on Meridian, building something from the inside out, making it actually function instead of just exist. That's what the foundation needs." She set down the bowl. "It's a different kind of work than what you've been doing." "It's the same kind of work," he said, "just a bigger room." "Is that a yes?" He turned back to the sink. He was quiet for a moment, washing a plate with the thorough attention he brought to things. "I want to understand one thing," he said. "What? Is this about the job or about—" He gestured slightly with the plate, which encompassed the kitchen and the apartment and the sound of Sophie doing homework down the hall and everything that lived in the space between them that neither of them had put direct words to. "Both," she said. "They're not the same decision, but they're not separate either. I know what you're capable of. That's professional, and I know who you are." She looked at him. "That's not." He set the plate down, turned around and looked at her the way he sometimes looked at things he was making a final decision about, completely, without the performance of deliberation. "Then yes," he said, "to both." She nodded. She picked up the bowl she'd dried and put it in the cabinet where it went, because she'd learned where it went 3 weeks ago and had filed that away without meaning to. "Logan," she said. She was looking at the cabinet rather than at him. "Yeah. I'm not good at this," she said. "The not work part. I'm aware of that. I've spent most of my life in a building I own, making decisions, and the parts of life that aren't decisions are the parts I've always been least fluent in." She turned around. "I'm telling you that because you should know it, and because I'm not going to pretend to be better at it than I am." "I know," he said. "I saw the pancakes." She laughed. She didn't do it often, and when she did it was slightly unexpected. Not polished, nothing like the professional smile she maintained for rooms full of investors. Real laughter, the kind with an edge of surprise in it. "I'm also not good at it," he said when she'd stopped. "I'm too internal. Sophie tells me I process everything alone and then present conclusions like they're weather forecasts instead of things I've been actually struggling with. She's not wrong." "You've been working on that," Celeste said. "Trying to." "So have I," she said. They stood in the kitchen with the quiet of the apartment around them and the distance between them that wasn't very much distance, and the understanding that this was where things were. Not perfectly, not without the specific complications of two people who had both spent a long time being necessary to others and not entirely sure how to be necessary to someone who actually wanted them specifically rather than functionally. "We'll figure it out," Logan said. Not as a promise. As a statement of fact, which was how he said most things. Yeah, Celeste said. We will. Down the hall, Sophie stopped writing, tilted her head toward the kitchen, and registered the quality of the quiet coming from that direction. Not the absence of conversation, but the kind of silence that happens when two people are in the same room and both of them are exactly where they mean to be. She looked at Captain Fluffington, who was sitting on the corner of her desk. Told you, she said. Then she went back to her homework. The question came on a Tuesday evening in April, which was unremarkable in every external way, the kind of evening that doesn't announce itself as significant and only reveals what it was in retrospect, when you're looking back from a distance and tracing the line between before and after. Celeste had come for dinner again. It was not Spaghetti Tuesday because Logan had decided, with the quiet unilateral confidence of someone exercising creative authority in his own kitchen, to attempt something new, a chicken and rice dish that Sophie had seen in a cooking video and requested with the specific persistence of a child who has identified something she wants and correctly calculated that repetition is her most effective tool. The attempt had been partially successful. The chicken was good. The rice had done something unexpected in the bottom of the pot that Logan had described as a texture issue, and Sophie had described as crunchy in a bad way. And they'd eaten it anyway because Logan Pierce did not throw out food that was still technically food. And Sophie had eaten her portion with the philosophical acceptance of someone who respected the effort, if not the outcome. Celeste had eaten all of hers. It wasn't that bad, she said when Logan caught her expression over the table. You don't have to be diplomatic, he said. I'm not being diplomatic. The chicken was genuinely good. The rice was crunchy in a bad way, Sophie supplied helpfully. It was a first attempt, Celeste said. My 12th recipe rotation is looking better, Logan said. The spaghetti is very good, Celeste said seriously, and Sophie laughed. And the kitchen was warm, and this was what Tuesday evenings looked like now. Imperfect food and honest assessments, and the specific ease of people who have stopped performing comfort for each other and started actually having it. After dinner, Sophie had gone to do her homework, a book report on a novel about a girl who discovers her grandmother was a renowned botanist, which Sophie had declared not as good as a book about ecosystems, but better than most things without dinosaurs. And Logan had made tea, which was a thing Celeste had learned he did in the evenings, a habit from somewhere in his Navy years that he'd never explained and she'd never asked about, sensing it was one of those small personal rituals that don't require narration. They were sitting at the kitchen table when Sophie came back. She appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, homework apparently finished or abandoned. With Sophie, it was difficult to tell which, because she approached completion and abandonment with similar energy. And she stood there for a moment looking at the two of them at the table with her specific brand of focused assessment. Sophie, Logan said, it's a school night. I know, she said. I finished the book report. Already? It wasn't that long. She came into the kitchen and sat down in her chair, the one that was hers now, in the way that things become someone's without a formal declaration, simply through repetition and the quiet agreement of everyone in the room. She put her elbows on the table, which Logan usually corrected and tonight didn't. She looked at Celeste. The look was the particular one that meant she'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided the thinking was finished, and it was time to say the thing. If you already love my dad, Sophie said, will you stay with us forever? The kitchen went very quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet. Not the silence of a question that has broken something. The silence of a question that has named something that everyone in the room already knew and had been moving around carefully for months, and which a 7-year-old had simply decided to walk directly toward because she had not yet learned the adult habit of circling what you actually mean. Celeste looked at Sophie. She looked at her completely, with the same attention she brought to things that mattered, not the managed attention of a professional in a meeting, but the real kind, the kind that means you're taking someone seriously as a person rather than as a situation to navigate. She didn't look at Logan. Not yet. She kept her eyes on Sophie because Sophie had asked the question, and Sophie deserved the answer first. That's a very direct question, Celeste said. Dad says direct questions get better answers than indirect ones, Sophie said. Your dad is right, Celeste said. She folded her hands on the table. I'm going to give you a direct answer, okay? Not a grown-up answer that sounds like an answer but isn't. Sophie nodded. Yes, Celeste said. I love your dad. And I don't know exactly what forever looks like yet because nobody does. And anyone who tells you they do is either very lucky or not being honest. But I know that I want to be here. That I choose to be here. and that choosing to stay is what actually matters more than promising forever. Sophie thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. "That's a good answer," she said finally. "It's honest." "I try to be," Celeste said. Sophie looked at her father then. He was sitting across the table, and he had the expression he got when something had happened that he hadn't entirely prepared for and was processing in real time. Not closed off, not performing composure, just genuinely feeling a thing in front of other people, which she had learned was harder for him than almost anything else he did. "Dad," Sophie said, "you should probably say something." He looked at his daughter for a moment. Then he looked at Celeste, and the expression on his face was not the managed steadiness she'd seen him wear through corporate investigations and evacuations and fabricated evidence and 100 professional pressures. It was something underneath all of that, the actual face, she thought, of who he was when none of those circumstances required him to be anything other than what he was. "She's right," he said. His voice was quiet. "I should probably say something." "You don't have to perform it," Celeste said. "You never have to perform anything for me." "I know." He was looking at her with that undefended look, the one she'd first seen in the Natural History Museum, the one that cost him something to show and that she understood exactly what it meant that he chose to show it. "I love you," he said. "That's the something." Sophie sat back in her chair with the expression of someone whose hypothesis has been confirmed by experimental data. "Good," she said. "Now, can we get a dog?" The moment broke. Logan looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who has just been outmaneuvered by someone a foot shorter than him. "Absolutely not. I've been researching breeds that are good with kids." "Sophie, golden retrievers are very loyal. Their emotional intelligence is documented." "It's a school night," he said. "Go to bed." She went unhurriedly, with the confidence of someone who has accomplished the primary objective and is willing to let the secondary one wait. At the hallway, she stopped and looked back at Celeste. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Sophie," Celeste said. Sophie went down the hall. They heard her bedroom door close. Then, after a moment, they heard it open slightly. The specific degree that meant Captain Fluffington had been repositioned and the door had been adjusted for optimal airflow, which was a thing Sophie did every night without explaining it. Logan looked at Celeste across the table. The tea had gone slightly cold. The kitchen light was the warm overhead kind that made everything look like it existed at a slight remove from the ordinary world, more itself somehow, more honest. "I meant it," he said. "The thing I said." "I know," she said. "I meant mine too." "I know," he said. They sat in the quiet for a while, not filling it. Outside, the city was doing its night business. Distant traffic, the low ambient sound of a place that never fully stops. The specific urban texture that had been the backdrop of both their lives for years without ever quite being home until recently. There's a thing that happens sometimes between people who have been through something real together. Not the performed intimacy of manufactured closeness, but the actual kind. The kind built from watching someone make hard decisions under pressure and learning through that, watching what they're actually made of. It doesn't arrive dramatically, it settles. And when it settles, it has a different weight than anything that arrived easily, because the cost of it is built into the foundation, and you know, in a specific and unromantic way, exactly what it took to get there. This was what was sitting at that kitchen table. Not a fairy tale, not a perfect thing. Two people who were both difficult in their own ways, and had both been broken by circumstances, and had both built functional lives from the pieces, and were now, carefully and imperfectly, deciding to build something larger. That decision was not small. It was also, finally, not frightening. The federal investigation into Marcus Hale concluded the following autumn. The proceedings had moved through their legal stages with the patience of institutions that have no particular incentive to rush, and the outcome, when it came, was comprehensive. Marcus Hale was found guilty on 4 counts related to financial fraud, insider manipulation, and corporate misconduct. His sentencing included restitution to Winslow Global and a prohibition from holding executive positions in publicly traded companies. The consulting firm that had served as the intermediary for his vendor arrangements was dissolved. 2 of the 3 executives who had been placed under administrative review were terminated with findings of misconduct. The 3rd cooperated fully and received a lesser outcome, which was the way these things usually went. Derek Souza lost his professional certification and settled a civil proceeding with terms that were confidential and widely understood to be punishing. The journalists who had published the original articles about Logan had all, by this point, issued corrections of varying thoroughness and specificity. The most complete correction came from the outlet that had run the regulatory filing story, 2 full paragraphs, with documentation acknowledging that the framing of their original reporting had been based on materials that were subsequently determined to be fabricated in bad faith. Celeste read that correction in her office and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something quieter. The specific relief of a record that has been made accurate. Not fixed, because some things don't fully fix, but corrected, which was what was available and was worth having. Logan read it over coffee on the same morning. He read it once, the same way he'd read all the others, carefully, completely, without particular reaction. Then he put his phone away and drove Sophie to school. At the Millhaven Elementary drop-off, he walked her to the door the way he always did. She hugged him, which was a thing she still did every morning despite being 8 now. And technically, she'd informed him, at an age where some kids thought hugging their parents was embarrassing. Is it embarrassing? He'd asked her 2 weeks ago, when she'd raised the topic with the seriousness of someone working through a social calculation. Not for me, she'd said. I thought about it, and I decided that embarrassing means caring what other people think more than caring what's actually true. And what's actually true is that I want to hug you. She'd shrugged. So, he'd thought about that for about 2 days afterward. He walked back to the truck. He had a foundation operations meeting at 9, a debrief from the program coordinators in 2 of the Southeast Asia regions where the Meridian Initiative's charitable arm had been running for 6 months. The numbers were significant, not the kind of significant that appeared in financial reports, which he'd always found a strange measure of things that mattered, but the kind that appeared in community health outcomes, in supply delivery rates to areas that had been chronically underserved, in the small specific improvements to people's actual daily existence that most corporate annual reports didn't have a line item for. He was good at this work in the way he'd always been good at things that required sustained attention and the willingness to stay with a problem long enough to understand it completely. He was also, he had learned, good at something he hadn't expected to be good at, talking about the work publicly, explaining it, making people who had money understand why it mattered to put that money in places that were difficult to reach and measured success in things you couldn't always photograph. Celeste had told him in March that he was better at the public-facing part of the foundation's work than she was. He'd disagreed. She'd looked at him with the patient expression she used when she was going to make a point she'd already fully reasoned through. I'm good at making people in a boardroom do what I need them to do, she said. You make people believe what you're telling them. That's different. That's harder. He'd thought about that for a while. He still wasn't entirely sure she was right, but he'd started to believe she might be. The Foundation's first annual report was published in October. It was 52 pages long and contained no photographs of executives or donors, only field documentation, aid workers, community coordinators, supply routes, outcome data. Logan had insisted on that, and the argument had been brief and decisive in the way arguments are when one person has thought something through completely and the other person, upon reflection, agrees. The report was covered by 3 publications that focused on corporate social responsibility. One of them ran an interview with Logan, the first he'd ever agreed to, which he'd consented to after a conversation with Celeste, in which she'd made the case that the Foundation's work deserved visibility, and visibility required someone willing to be visible. You spent your whole career doing important things that nobody knew about, she'd said. The Navy, the Meridian work. At some point, the invisibility stops being humility and starts being, what? He'd asked. She'd chosen the word carefully. Withholding, she said, from people who need to see that this kind of work is possible. He'd sat with that for several days. He did the interview, the journalist, a woman named Patricia Kurtz, who covered humanitarian supply chains and had been following the Meridian Initiative since the first business publication article 2 years earlier, asked him at the end of the interview why he thought so many corporate philanthropic programs failed to deliver meaningful outcomes. He thought about it for a moment. He thought about the room on the 7th floor that had smelled of someone's old ambition, and the spreadsheets that had been updated in header format only, and the Nadia who'd had 3 ignored proposals and was waiting for someone to mean what they said. Because meaning it is harder than funding it, he said. Anyone can fund something. That's just money. Meaning it means showing up when the supply chain collapses, when the regional coordinator quits, when the data says you're doing it wrong and you have to start over. Most organizations aren't built to show up for that. They're built to announce things and then manage how the announcement looks. Patricia Kurtz looked at him for a moment. How do you build an organization that actually shows up? You put people in charge of it who've already been through something, he said. People who understand that most things worth doing are mostly just showing up, over and over, when it's not interesting anymore. The interview ran in full. Celeste read it on the morning it published and sent him a message that said only, "That's exactly right." He read it in the parking structure before a regional coordinator call and sent back, "The journalist was good." Celeste replied, "You were better." He put his phone away and went to the call. These were the rhythms of their life together. Not grand, not cinematic, mostly just the daily accumulation of things said and done and chosen, the ordinary texture of 2 people who had decided to be in the same direction. Celeste moved more of the company's philanthropic investment into the foundation over the following year. It was a structural decision that the board debated with varying degrees of enthusiasm and eventually approved, because the foundation's numbers were becoming impossible to argue with and because Harriet Blum, who remained in the interim chair position, with the firm intention of keeping it until someone better came along, which in her assessment had not happened yet, was not a person inclined to let short-sighted profit calculations override documented human outcomes. The corporate empire did not shrink. Winslow Global remained what it had always been: large, globally operational, financially complex in ways that kept entire teams of analysts employed and would continue to do so for as long as markets existed. What changed was its center of gravity, not visibly, not in the ways that show up in quarterly reports, but in the texture of how decisions were made, and who was in the room when they were made, and what question got asked first. Celeste had started asking a different question first. The question was, what does this actually do for people who aren't in this room? It was not a comfortable question. It rarely produced the cleanest answer. It had made several meetings longer than they otherwise would have been. She asked it anyway, every time. Logan proposed in November, which was 14 months after the question Sophie had asked at the kitchen table, and 8 months after the conversation in the kitchen when they had both said what they meant and let it settle. He didn't plan the proposal in the way that proposals are sometimes planned, with orchestrated moments and coordinated witnesses and the performance of significance. He thought about doing it that way and decided that performing significance for something that was already significant was a contradiction, and that the right place was the right place regardless of what it looked like to anyone else. The oak tree on Hargrove Avenue was not romantic in any conventional sense. It was a street tree, old, thick-trunked, planted in a sidewalk cut out near the corner where the accident had happened 18 months earlier. The one where Logan had pulled a woman he didn't know off a concrete divider and changed both their lives without intending to. The tree had probably been there for 40 years. It was the kind of tree that exists in cities as a reminder that something was there before the buildings and will still be there after, which is either comforting or unsettling depending on how you feel about time. It was a Sunday afternoon. Sophie was with Logan's neighbor, a retired woman named Gloria, who had been Sophie's unofficial emergency backup adult for 3 years, and who had agreed, when Logan called and asked without explaining why, to take Sophie for a few hours with the equanimity of someone who had learned not to ask too many questions about the Pierce household, because the answers were usually more interesting than she had time for. He'd asked Celeste to walk with him. She'd asked where. He'd said just a walk, which she'd accepted without pushing, because she'd learned that Logan Pierce said just a walk when he meant something, and that pressing the meaning out early was less interesting than waiting for it to arrive. They'd walked for 20 minutes in the late November afternoon, the city gray and sharp-aired around them, and then he'd stopped at the oak tree on Hargrove Avenue. She looked at it, then at him. "This is the corner," she said. "Yeah." She looked at the concrete divider. It had been repaired. Fresh concrete, slightly lighter in color than the surrounding pavement, the clean seam of something fixed after damage. She looked at the tree, which had lost most of its leaves and stood in its sidewalk, cut out with the patient indifference of something old enough to have stopped keeping track. "I've walked past this corner 3 times since then," she said. "I never told you that." Why did you walk past it? She was quiet for a moment. I'm not entirely sure. It felt important to look at it. The way you look at something that changed your life from a distance, to see if you can understand it better from outside it. Did it work? Not really, she said. Some things don't make more sense from further away. They just look smaller. He reached into his jacket pocket. She saw the movement and went completely still. Not dramatically, just the specific stillness of someone whose body has understood something before their mind has finished processing it. I'm not going to make a speech, he said. You know I don't do speeches. I know, she said. I'm also not going to pretend this is simple or that I know exactly how all of it works from here. We're two difficult people, and there's a kid involved who has opinions about dog breeds and ecosystems and the intellectual merits of pistachio ice cream, and all of that is complicated. Yes, Celeste said. But I know what kind of person you are, he said. I know it the way you know things that matter, not because someone told you, but because you watched and paid attention and saw the real version, not the performed version. He opened the box. And the real version is someone I want to build something with. She looked at the ring. It was not the largest thing she'd ever seen. He was not a man who expressed meaning through scale. It was a simple, clean setting, the kind that doesn't compete with what it's supposed to mean. She looked at him. Yes, she said. Obviously yes. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at it on her hand for a moment with the expression of someone taking a thing seriously that deserved to be taken seriously. Not theatrically, not with the breathless performance of romantic obligation, but with the genuine weight of someone who understands that yes is not a feeling, it's a decision, and that decisions made clearly and honestly are the only ones worth making. Then she looked up at him. Sophie is going to say she knew, Celeste said. She did know, Logan said. She told me in September that I was taking too long. Celeste laughed. The real one, the one with the surprised edge. What did you tell her? I told her good things take the time they take. What did she say? She said that was a very dad answer and that she'd given me until December. Celeste looked at him with an expression he'd come to recognize as one of her actual ones. Not the public face, not the professional composure, but the face underneath. The one that came out in kitchens with cold tea and in natural history museums and on sidewalks in November next to trees that had been standing long enough to have witnessed things neither of them would ever know. Good thing you came in under deadline, she said. I'm a logistics man, he said. I respect timelines. They walked back. The city moved around them the way cities move. Indifferently, continuously, full of other people's lives intersecting and diverging in patterns too complex for any single person to track. Celeste threaded her arm through Logan's, which was a thing she'd done before but which felt different now in the specific way that the same action can feel different when the weight behind it has changed. She thought, walking, about the question Sophie had asked at the kitchen table. Will you stay with us forever? And about the answer she'd given, which was the truest answer she had. Not a promise of forever, because she'd learned early and expensively that permanence was not something people could guarantee to each other, only something they could choose toward, repeatedly, in the ordinary moments that don't feel like decisions but are. She was 31 years old, she had built a company from $110,000 and a stubborn idea. She had survived a conspiracy that had used the machinery of her own institution against someone she loved. She had learned to make chocolate chip pancakes that were technically edible, to sit at a kitchen table with an uneven leg without fixing it, to wait in school parking lots and discuss prehistoric ocean creatures with an 8-year-old who treated knowledge as the only currency worth collecting. She had learned, most unexpectedly, that the things she'd spent her professional life measuring, value, return, investment, yield, had a version that didn't appear on any balance sheet she'd ever seen. It looked like a man who drove the same route every morning without variation. It looked like a child who hugged you because it was true, not because it was convenient. It looked like a kitchen in November, and a tree on a city sidewalk, and the specific improbable chain of events that begins with a traffic accident and a concrete divider and a stranger who gets out of his truck without planning to and changes the whole direction of things. She had almost missed it. The merger paperwork had been right there, and the pen, and the version of her life that would have continued without interruption in the direction it had already been going, which was successful and recognized, and also somehow, she understood now, beside the point. The largest investments carry the largest risk. Every serious investor knows this, which is why so many serious investors hedge their positions and protect their exposure and avoid the things most likely to hurt them if they go wrong. She had spent 15 years being a serious investor in exactly that sense, not only with money, but with herself, with trust, with the parts of a life that can't be recovered easily if they're lost. Logan Pierce had not been a hedge. He had been the exact opposite of a hedge. He was the unprotected position, the one with the greatest exposure, the one that could have cost her everything if it had gone wrong. It had not gone wrong. She thought about what that meant, not in terms of luck, because luck was only the name people gave to outcomes they hadn't fully traced back to their causes. What it actually meant was something simpler and harder to articulate, that the willingness to be exposed, to be actually vulnerable, rather than the managed performance of openness, was the only way any of the real things happened. The company she'd built had required it. The foundation required it. And the man walking beside her, and the child who was at this moment almost certainly negotiating with Gloria about whether one cookie or two was an appropriate afternoon snack, required it most of all. You couldn't love something at arm's length. You couldn't build something you weren't willing to risk. You couldn't stay unless you chose, every ordinary day, to stay. Sophie was returned to the apartment at 4:30 by Gloria, who had the expression of someone who had given 2 cookies and considered the decision justified. Sophie came through the door with her shoes only half on, saw her father and Celeste at the kitchen table, looked at Celeste's left hand, and stopped. She looked at the ring. She looked at Logan. She looked at Celeste. "I knew it," she said. "I know you knew it," Logan said. "I told you September was reasonable." "You got November. That's close." Sophie came to the table and sat in her chair. She looked at both of them with the comprehensive assessment of someone conducting a final review. Then something happened in her face. Not the performance of happiness, not the theatrical joy of a child told to react a certain way, but something underneath that, quieter and more real. The expression of someone who had been hoping for something for a long time and is now looking at the actual thing and finding that it matches. "I'm going to have 2 parents again," she said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just as a statement of the thing that was true, said plainly in the way she said things that mattered. Celeste reached across the table and covered Sophie's hand with hers. She didn't say anything. Some things don't need addition. Sophie looked at her hand under Celeste's. "Can we get a dog now?" she asked. Logan closed his eyes briefly. "Sophie, I've been very patient," she said. "I have documentation." "You don't have documentation." "I have a list on my tablet. I've been adding to it since February." Celeste looked at Logan. Her expression was not helping him. "You're not going to defend me on this," he said. "I genuinely haven't decided yet," she said. "That means yes," Sophie said. "When she hasn't decided yet, it means yes. I've been studying her." Celeste looked at the 8-year-old who had been studying her and felt the specific helpless warmth of someone who has been seen clearly by a child and has no available defense against it. "We'll discuss it," Logan said. "As a family. Later." Sophie accepted this with the patience of someone who has won the substantive point and is willing to let the procedural discussion happen at its own pace. She got up from the table and went to get Captain Fluffington from her room, which was a thing she did when she was happy and wanted company, and she came back and sat with the rabbit on the table between her and the 2 adults who were, as of today, going to be her family. The kitchen was warm. The city moved outside the window. The table had its uneven leg and the shimmied cardboard and the particular familiarity of a place that has been lived in long enough to stop being a space and start being a home. This is what it looked like in the end, and in the beginning, because endings that are real always contain their own beginning. Not the version where everything resolves cleanly and the hard parts disappear and love is easy because 2 people deserve each other. The real version, a kitchen table on a Tuesday in November, a ring that wasn't the largest thing in the room, a child with a rabbit and a list of golden retrievers on her tablet, 2 people who had come to each other through accidents and conspiracies and resignation letters, and a concrete divider on Hargrove Avenue, who had both been broken in different ways and had both rebuilt themselves into something that worked, and who had chosen, in the ordinary honest way of choosing, to build something together. The greatest fortunes are not the ones that protect you from loss. They are the ones worth risking loss for. They are the ones you count not in what you've accumulated, but in what you've chosen, the specific, imperfect, daily choice to show up for the people you love in all the ordinary moments that don't feel like they matter and turn out to be the only thing that does. Logan Pierce had spent 4 years learning how to be the only parent in the room and doing it well because his daughter was watching. He had not been looking for anything else. Celeste Winslow had spent 15 years building something large and true and had not understood, until a stranger got out of a truck on a Tuesday, that the largest true thing she would ever build would not be a company. Sophie Pierce had always known. She just needed everyone else to catch up. Outside the kitchen window, November moved toward December, and the oak tree on Hargrove Avenue stood in its sidewalk cut out with its November patience, and the city went about its indifferent, continuous life. And inside the apartment on the third floor, the lights were on, and the table was uneven, and a 7-8-year-old was explaining golden retriever temperament to 2 adults who were listening. Some stories end in boardrooms. Some end in courtrooms, with verdicts and restitution and the satisfying administrative closure of wrongdoing accounted for. Some end in the moment the hero realizes what they are. This one ended at a kitchen table, which is exactly where it was always going to end if you knew how to read the map.